I'm privileged to introduce John Mills, who's a well-known member of our committee at CIB and represents the Labour Euro Safeguards campaign. I hope some of you get the mailings from him. If not, get it from him, because they talk about succinct ways of putting basic issues on the EU. John excels at that. His deep political commitment is matched by an outstanding successful business career, which is always a good recommendation. He is a chairman of John Mills Limited, an import-export company with a turnover of 100 million, which was recently selected as among the 500 most dynamic companies in Europe. Well, looking at the continent, you think, well, that's not difficult competition. That's not my
We're now down the top 150. We're now in top 150.
150?
Here we are.
Yeah, and rising fast, I would guess. And I have a note here that if you have ever stopped at one of those TV screen displays in supermarkets for ingenious gadgets, the chances are it's one of John's. He was also the national agent for the No side in the 1975 campaign, so the DNA of being anti-EU in that respect, it goes back a long way. I have to confess that my father voted for it in 1975 on the basis that it would make the wine cheaper. He only discovered later that it neither did that and that it was also something rather different. I, unfortunately, was in Nigeria, so I couldn't vote, and I probably would have got it wrong. So anyway, with no further ado, I hand over to you, John. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, one thing I think I did do was to get it right in 1975, although the result, as I'm sure you'll recollect, was actually a pretty telling defeat for the Eurosceptic movement. We lost by a factor of 2 to 1, and the real danger is, I think, that we finish up by doing the same thing again. And what I really want to talk to you about this afternoon is what I think we may be able to do to avoid that happening. It may be worth starting by just saying a little bit about, or picking up one or two of the themes that came out of the discussion this morning about the EU. I mean, my perspective on the common market as it was then in 1975 was that we joined on very unfavourable terms. At that stage, I didn't think the European Union itself was a particularly bad organisation, and I think that it doesn't actually do us any favours to say that the European Union was the creation of the devil, never done anything right all the way through. So I think some of the things it did really were quite successful. I think it was a help in reconciling France and Germany after the war. I think it played a very important part when the communist regimes in Eastern Europe collapsed, in drawing them towards the West and to democracy and rule of law and this kind of thing. Similarly with the dictatorships that were in southern Europe. So I think it has got some of the things it's done well, and including, to be honest with you, some of that I would include among that some of the social legislation that's pushed forward. So I think just paint it all as all black is not sensible. On the other hand, I think what has happened is that in many ways, even for those who support the whole concept of the European Union, there's a very plausible argument, I think, that it's lost its way over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly with the creation of the euro, which has obviously been an absolutely disastrous mistake. And then when you combine that with the lack of democratic control and the corruption and all the lack of democracy, all these other things, I think what's now happened among a lot of people in this country is that they are aware, first of all, of the fact that the terms in which we're in the European Union are very poor because they haven't improved. In fact, in many ways, they've got worse as our contributions have gone up and more regulation and so forth. But secondly, that the European Union, which was something of an ideal 20 or 30 years ago, has drifted away from that now and is therefore much less of an attractive proposition for itself to be part of. So that's a sort of background there. And if we are going to do anything about all this, I think the most important thing really that we need to do is to work out a realistic strategy. And I have to say that if we had a referendum tomorrow, and this has been referred to several times today, in my judgment there would be something of the order maybe 60-40 in favour of staying in. And I think the two really, really powerful arguments that would be used by those who were supporting us staying in were, first of all, the jobs argument, which I don't think we really managed to counteract all that much, but even more important, the fear argument, that what are we going to be doing if we're outside the European Union? Is it going to be a chilly world out there with no support? Are we going to be buffeted around by world events over which we've got no control? And these are very, very powerful arguments which we need to make sure that we can counteract. But we have got some things much more on our side than we did in 1975. And I think it's just worth running very briefly through at least some of them. One is, in 1975, with the exception of, I think it was the Daily Worker, as it was called in those days, there wasn't a single national newspaper who was in favour of coming out. Of course, the referendum in 1975 wasn't whether we were going to come in or go out. We were already in, and it's a question of whether we were going to come out. But there wasn't a single national newspaper, apart from the Daily Worker, what's the Spectator? Okay, and the Spectator. But that was the scenario we had. The business world was very largely in favour of staying in. So was the vast bulk of the Conservative Party in those days. It was the Labour Party, actually, that split roughly 50-50. And the Conservative Party split roughly 80-20, which was why the end result was the 2-to-1 that eventually we saw. So we have got some things that are moving in our favour already. But I think there are also a number of other really important developments that may work in our favour too. One is that, in my view, and I suspect this is a view strongly shared in this room, the whole Eurozone and single currency situation looks very, very unstable. It had a relatively quiescent patch over the last few months, but the events in Cyprus have shown just how weak those foundations really are. And Cyprus is only 0.2% of the entire EU GDP. And if 0.2% can rock the boat the way it has, you really begin to wonder what would happen if you had similar sorts of problems in Italy or Spain, let alone Greece. So I think there's a fair chance that what we're going to see over the coming period is the European Union in really dire trouble if the euro collapses. But that may very well not happen. Even if it doesn't, I think you're going to have years and years of austerity in the European Union while the whole single currency exercise plays its way out. I think it's very difficult to see how we're going to get any growth, and this of course was reflected in the sort of figures that Ian gave us earlier on today. And then on top of that, there are all the issues that around democracy, the fact that they're going to have to do something if they're going to shore the euro up at all, to have further integration, debt mutualisation, all this kind of thing. So there's going to be more Europe in Europe at the same time as people in this country, generally speaking, are moving in favour of disengagement. So there are various trends that are moving in our direction. But what we really need to do, I think, is to focus on what then needs to be done to try and achieve what I think everybody in this room wants. And I think it's important to realise there's a sequence of 3 different things that are going to happen. The first is, we're never going to leave the European Union unless there is a referendum. There's no other effective route to getting out of the EU other than a referendum being held, and we won't get a referendum unless there is a majority of people in the House of Commons who are going to vote for it. So the first objective is we've got to have a majority of the MPs in the House of Commons voting in favour of having a referendum. The second thing we've got to do, if there is a referendum, is to win the referendum. But there's still a third thing which we've got to do, which again was alluded to earlier on, which is that once you run the referendum, are we then going to get enough focus and energy and commitment in Parliament actually to execute what the people have decided? So there is a really major series of tasks that have got to be done, which in many ways are much more nuanced than just advocating we all come out of the European Union tomorrow, because that won't happen unless this process I've just described has been gone through. And what I'd like to do is to run through then what I think we need to think about to make sure that this process, which I've just described, goes through and works. The first thing is to do with timing. As I said earlier on, if we had a referendum tomorrow, my guess is we would lose it. But I think that the timing over the next 3 or 4 years is likely to be more favourable to us for the reasons which I described earlier on. So we've got a much better chance of winning a referendum in 3 or 4 years' time than we have now, simply because of external events. But also, there are many other things we've got to do to make sure that we actually get to the end position we want to be. And if you look at the way we may or may not have a referendum, and look at the politics of it all, this is how it looks to me to stack up. I think that the Conservatives are now pretty well committed to having a referendum in the next Parliament, but they may not get elected. There is, I would have thought, a much higher chance you're going to have some sort of coalition government after the next election. Of course, you can't be sure, but that seems to be quite possible. It may be a Conservative Lib Dem coalition, or it could be a Labour Lib Dem coalition if things go the other way.
Or Conservative UKIP.
Well, I think the problem with UKIP, to be honest with you, is that UKIP is very unlikely to win more than maybe 1 or 2 seats, maybe a little bit more, but is not going to be in a position, realistically, to sway the government one way or the other. And I think one of the really important things to do is to be realistic about what may happen, rather than to depend on hopeful outcomes from your perspective, which may not materialise. But if we're going to have the Conservatives not in a majority, which seems quite likely, then the really crucial swing element in terms of Labour votes, it's going parliamentary votes, is going to be what happens to the Labour Party. And so one of the most important objectives we've now got is to try and get the Labour Party to commit itself to having a referendum in the next Parliament. Now, this may look a very daunting task to start off with, because the Labour Party, generally speaking, is pretty Europhile. But I think that the Labour Party is going to be in some considerable difficulty if it goes into the next general election with the Conservatives saying they are definitely going to give the people an in-out vote on the, or certainly a vote on the European Union, and Labour says it isn't. This seems to me to be a pretty untenable position for the Labour Party to have. But it's going to take some pushing and shoving to get the Labour Party to agree to put that in its manifesto. And one of the things that I'm very much involved in with the Labour for a Referendum campaign, which we're running, is to try to get that done. We've got a couple of years, or maybe a bit less than that, before the manifesto is finalised to get that done. The second thing we have to do is we have to get a clearer message out about what will happen if there is a referendum and a no vote and we do come out of the European Union. And there is quite a lot of work going on behind the scenes. Ian and I are involved in one working party, but there's other people working on this as well. Because I do think we need a much clearer vision about what coming out of the EU would actually entail, and what the end game would be once we come out than we have at the moment. Because going back to what I said earlier on, if fear is the biggest single card that the pro-EU people have got in their hands, they will certainly play very heavily on the fear that everybody will have of the unknown if we're not in the EU as we are now. So there's a big educational exercise to be done with the public at large. But again, reflecting on some of the discussion we had this morning, I think Ian very forcefully made the point, which I think is absolutely right, that it's opinion formers, many of them in London, many of them associated with the national press and the BBC and some of the other organisations, producing weekly publications and so on, which are the real opinion setters, who are the people whose faith at the moment in the European Union needs to be challenged and changed. And this is why I think that the sort of work that Ian's been doing, and others, on looking really carefully at what these alternatives are and highlighting the difficulties that our existing memberships got, and highlighting the cost of it all and regulations, all these other things, is absolutely crucially important. Because I can tell you that if a referendum is held, there is going to be an absolute deluge of money and pressure from the European Union to keep us staying in. I've got actually some figures here which are just worth reading out to you as to what happened in 1975, or just before and after, because it isn't true that the British public opinion has got significantly more Eurosceptic over the last few years than it was previously. Let me just read these figures out to you. In the autumn of 1973, those who thought that membership of the common market is, open inverted commas, a good thing, in the UK was 40%. In 1974, it dropped to 36%. In 1975, the year when the referendum was held, it was 50%. So support for staying in went from 36% to 50% in 12 months. Absolutely massive swing in favour. Because there were abstentions, roughly 25%, whatever the numbers are, must have been in favour by that stage, which produced a 2-to-1 majority. But in 1976, opinion swung right down again. Only 39%, 1977, 35%, and 1978, 29% were in favour. And that, I think, is actually a lower figure than you've got now. So there's been a long history of people in this country saying that they're Eurosceptic, but actually, when it comes to the crunch, when they've actually got to make a decision, when there's actually a referendum in front of them, there's a massive swing, as happened in 1975, with all the money and the fear card being played towards people staying in. So that's what we've got to counteract by the work that needs to be done to persuade opinion formers. But there's also another absolutely crucial thing that we have to do, and that is to put the Eurosceptic case not only very generally to the public at large, but very specifically to the business vote and the wider swing vote that there's going to be in the middle. This is what Daniel Hodson referred to this morning. These are people in the city, these are people who run major companies, and these are people who it's crucially important that we do bring with us. Now, I think one of the reasons why, if we had a referendum tomorrow, we might lose is because although people are in many ways dissatisfied with the membership terms we've got at the moment, they don't really know what the alternative might be, and at the same time there hasn't been a real serious attempt to change those terms and then to assess the situation once that's been done. And I think we've got a much better chance of having a referendum and winning it if we go through a renegotiation process and come out at the end of the day knowing very definitely what the future is going to be, rather than just in the hope that things may get better. And I think, in fact, this is very largely where public opinion in this country is. I mean, there are certainly quite a lot of people who would come out, vote for coming out in any circumstances, many of you here this afternoon, no doubt. There's also lots of people who would vote for staying in, whatever happens, but there's a huge number of people in the middle, the swing vote, who I think are likely to judge the situation in the light of what actually happens, and who would feel that coming out before we've had a chance to renegotiate and see whether we can improve these terms is going to be a sensible thing to do. And this is one of the reasons why this new organisation which I'm involved in, and Daniel is, has been set up. Because I think there probably will be some sort of renegotiation process going on over the next few years. And somebody has got to hold these people to account, to enunciate the 5 principles that underpinned the speech which David Cameron gave in January this year, to set out what the red lines are and to make an assessment about whether these terms are acceptable or not. And one of the problems about getting all this done and getting enough of the business world on side, as was done with Business for Sterling over the euro 10 or 12 years ago, is that it costs a large amount of money to get this done. And this new organisation that we're setting up is going to have a budget of the thick end of £1 million a year to do all the things which I've just described. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's very important that CIB is involved in all this. It's because most of the Eurosceptic organisations we've got at the moment have got relatively limited budgets and relatively limited leverage in actually getting much done to change public opinion. Whereas what's needed to be undertaken to get this really crucial swing group on our side is to put an enormous amount of effort, which does cost money, behind the reassessment and the arguments and the meetings and the propaganda and the convincing of people that needs to be undertaken. So there is a very big agenda here, which I hope we can all be involved in. What we need, I think, is not a new organisation to compete with all the other ones which we've got already. Although actually I've always thought that diversity was one of the strengths of the Eurosceptic movement rather than the reverse, because people have different views about the EU and its strengths and weaknesses. But what we need is some overarching organisation now which can take forward the challenge which we've got coming up over the coming period. And I think one of the really crucial things that also we need to do if we're going to win is we've got to win over some, at least, of the senior politicians in this country, in Parliament and in national life. I mean, one of the great weaknesses in the 1975 referendum was that although we started off with the public opinion being in favour of coming out, by the time you had all the centrist politicians who most people trusted all singing from the same hymn sheet, but we had people on the right of the Conservative Party and the left of the Labour Party who wouldn't share platforms and had very different views about it all, you finished up with a very discordant message which simply didn't convince most people to vote the right way. So I think one of the other really important things that we need to do is to see whether we can win over some of the really crucial central people in the political world on the left of the Conservative Party and on the right of the Labour Party to realising that this country needs to have a change. Now this is going to be a very tricky agenda, and it's going to involve some ducking and diving, quite honestly, to get there. I mean, if you talk about a referendum, getting a majority for a referendum, to get that done, you need to have on side not only people who want to have a referendum because they want to vote out, you need to have the people on side who want a referendum because they think that it's important that the country makes up its mind which way it's going to go, and they would vote in favour of it. So it's quite a nuanced kind of approach that has to be done to get over that particular hurdle. Then there's the next hurdle to be overcome, which is if we do get a referendum, actually winning it. And there again, you've got a different set of people, different set of arguments that are going to have to apply, which I'm sure all of you will be involved in, but which we've got to get right. But then finally, just to reiterate, what we've got to do is to build enough of a political consensus, not only in the country, but also in Parliament, that if the people have spoken and said they want to go out of the European Union, that this will then be executed. So there's an enormous series of challenges in front of us. But having been involved in all of this for a long period of time, it does seem to me that we've now got a better prospect of pulling off what I've just described than we've ever had before. I think time is to some extent on our side, that the European Union has tripped up, that we have managed to change public opinion quite a long way. We've still got a further way to go. We've got more of the sort of bastions of pro-Europeanism looking a bit shakier. We've got more people who are critical opinion formers on our side. So we've got some hope, and some challenges to overcome to get there, but I think we have got a real prospect of achieving over the next few years what we want if we all play our cards right, stick together and make sure it happens.